Okay, well, I titled this week, Rorty Finds His Voice, because in these articles that we read, basically spanning the 1980s, Rorty really comes into his own, begins saying adopting the characteristic tone and vocabulary that he'll use for the rest of his life. And what I hope for us is that we'll begin to master that idiom, so that at least you can have a Rorty voice in your head and sort of know how he would respond to things you're thinking or things you're reading. I mentioned last time that I think these essays are a lot of fun to read. Certainly, if we compare them to your average philosophy article from a contemporary journal that one would read, these are impassioned pieces. This is a man with a mission and a message. I didn't mention that an extremely common response to reading him is not so much amusement as anger. Most of us are committed to philosophy with a capital P, the kind that he's rejecting and making fun of. I know, this is the genre I work in and live my life in, and it can be very upsetting to have him dismiss the entire enterprise as something that was a lot of fun while it lasted, but is over and done now, that anyone who has the eyes to see it will move on to something else. Now, the issues that he raises are going to be with us for the rest of the course. And what I'm hoping for today is to get his vocabulary on the table and begin to indicate some of the lines of argument that stand behind it. If he makes you angry, good. There's a potential paper topic there for you. You might recall that Rorty was my Dr. Vater. I used to have arguments with him as I was first coming into the profession, was passionately committed to it, to the possibilities of working within this tradition that he was blithely dismissive of, and that Rorty voice that I'm hoping to plant at least a small version of in your heads is certainly my constant companion. We have here, I think, an example of the kind of advantage that we latecomers have over reading the mighty dead. We're reading Rorty's papers in the final form, the best form he could put them into. But we're in a position to treat them as rough drafts of a better telling of the story that he's telling, one that separates out the arguments and concepts better than he does. T.S. Eliot says, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Precisely, he says, and they are what we know. And in this case, I think we will end up knowing more about Rorty's arguments than he did, but that's because of all the work that he did trying again and again from different angles to articulate these points. So I'm imagining telling this story here today in 5 parts. First, I want to introduce the most basic concepts and distinctions that Rorty's working with, sort of introduction to pragmatism. Second, I want to talk a little bit about all the distinctions that he rejects on the basis of his pragmatism. I want to call this his promiscuous anti-bifurcationism. And I think it's one of the most radical features of his view. Then I want to talk specifically about the topic that he begins his presidential address in 1980. That was the first thing we read, with this claim of William James that truth just is what is good in the way of belief. So I want to talk about the arguments in the vicinity of the concept of truth. And then I want to talk about the anti-representationalism, which he explicitly thematizes in the introduction to his collection of essays, Objectivity, Relativism, so on. And then finally, if there's time, I'd like to say something about how I understand the course of his intellectual development that got him to where he is when we're reading these essays from the 80s. And this is the story that I've told elsewhere in my article called an Arc of Thought, which, if you're curious or just a glutton for punishment, on the website under the video and audio, you can hear me giving that lecture in German. It was the first philosophical lecture I gave in German. Okay. Rorty, without explicitly telling us this, is working within a Deweyan conception of pragmatism. And I wanted to start off with this because Rorty takes for granted a broadly Deweyan distinction between Platonism with a small p and pragmatism. The Platonism with a small p is because it's not just Plato, that would be the large, the capital letter, but a view that he sees going down through the history of philosophy. And this is basically what's at issue between them is basically an order of explanation or an order of conceptual priority between principles on the one hand and practices on the other. Between something that's explicit in the form of a rule or a principle, something that can be said, and what's implicit in something we can only do. This is a distinction that Gilbert Ryle articulates as a distinction between knowing that and knowing how. We'll see Rorty invoking it under the heading of theoria versus phronesis as the most fundamental aspect of human cognition and understanding. And Dewey's picture is that the Platonists look for some principle or rule, something that is explicit or could be made explicit behind every implicit propriety or practical skill. When they see a practical capacity, the capacity to make good, of a cobbler to make good shoes, they want to know what the form is that's behind that. When they see us able to understand something in our practice to show practical mastery of it, they look for a representation behind it, a principle, something that's guiding us in our skillful activities. The pragmatist is the one who treats the practice as prior to the principle, who thinks that explicit principles or theories float on a sea of implicit practical skills, that the very capacity to understand an explicit rule or principle itself requires a distinctive kind of practical skill, the capacity to interpret it or to be guided by it. This is this pragmatist line of thought in Dewey's sense is what is behind Wittgenstein's talking about the practical skills involved in understanding or following a rule. The capacity to understand it, to apply it to novel cases, to have mastered the use of the rule. Wittgenstein's concerned with what you have to be able to do in order to do that, the practical background of it. So Rorty is going to follow Dewey in seeing representationalism as just the distinctively modern form of Platonism. Instead of looking for forms of a Platonic, Aristotelian, or scholastic sort, the Enlightenment, as retrospectively understood by Kant, introduces this more abstract notion of expression as the explicit guide to our practical know-how. So that's the overarching sort of conceptual frame that within which Rorty is going to recommend pragmatism as opposed to distinctively modern representationalist Platonism, he's going to say. And of course, Kant is the avatar of that distinctively modern form of representationalism. For Kant, the notion of representation and the notion of rule are two sides of one complicated coin. As I said, working out the exact relations between the notion of representation and the notion of rule in Kant is as well. But for Rorty following Dewey, Kant thinking of the form of discursive normativity as being the rule is endorsing a Platonistic rule or principle first view rather than the sort of practice first view, which Dewey puts forward, which the Heidegger of Sein und Zeit endorses, and which the later Wittgenstein does as well. Let me pause there for remarks about this. I hope that the sort of general opposition here is a somewhat familiar one. Okay, let me say something about the conceptual apparatus that Rorty is bringing to the party here. Everything he does after about 1980 is conducted in what we could call the vocabulary. This concept of a vocabulary is absolutely at the center of Rorty's thought. And again, he isn't very explicit about where this comes from or why he's using it. But we talked last time in connection with chapter 4 of Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature about Quine's argument in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which could be variously described as arguing on pragmatic grounds that there isn't a distinction between claims that are made true or inferences that are made good because of the meanings of words on the one hand, and claims that are true or inferences that are good because of very general facts about the way the world is on the other hand. Quine is putting in a box claims like cats are mammals and there have been black dogs, and saying if you look at the practices of using expressions like that and what sort of radical changes there would have to be for us to decide that those claims weren't true, that the implications that those claims support were not good implications, you don't see a radical difference of kind. So Quine says we should cease to make the meaning theory distinction, the meaning belief distinction, or the language theory distinction. We should realize that all there is the use of our expressions. And it's the use of our expressions, those practices, that determine both what they mean and what we take to be true. And if you substantially altered what we took to be true, that would affect the meanings. And if you change the meanings, which sentences we take to be true would be different. These are different aspects of the use of the one thing that there really is, the practices of using the expressions. So Quine's target there is Carnap, who, thinking about artificial languages, says, look, it's a sequential process. First, you fix the meanings, fix the language that you're speaking, and then you go out into the world to determine what your theory should be. What's true, which of those sentences, given that they mean what they mean, are true in the world, which inferences connecting them are good, given the facts. And Quine says, if you look at natural languages, all there is are the things we say, the things we commit ourselves to take true, and the moves that we take to be good. And there isn't a practical distinction that corresponds to this meaning belief distinction or language theory distinction. And Rorty thinks this is absolutely right. It's a paradigm of a pragmatist undercutting of a philosophical distinction, the distinction between meaning and belief, the subject matter of semantics and epistemology, which we're going to say you have to pursue both of those together. And his suggestion of a successor notion to the notion of languages and theories is vocabularies. Vocabulary is supposed to be what we deploy in our discursive practices, and we're to train ourselves to think in a Quinean, post-Quinean way, in a way that's taken Quine's lessons on board, by using this notion of a vocabulary. So that's why this notion is so central to him. He's thinking about discursive practices, and his central term for doing that is going to be vocabulary. Now, this is what he starts off in this in his APA essay, the Pragmatism, Relativism, and Irrationalism essay. He just starts using this notion of a vocabulary, and a good deal of what he says, particularly in the first half of that essay, you could understand in pre-Quinean Carnapian terms, because Carnap too had been a kind of pragmatist. Carnap's view was that you should be a pragmatist about your choice of language, about what to mean, that was entirely up to you, and so you should consult your own convenience in stipulating the meanings of your expressions. And then once you had fixed the meanings, then it was no longer up to you which of the sentences with those meanings were true. So free choice, be a pragmatist about choice of meanings, but then be a realist, a representationalist. You have about the beliefs, the theories that you endorse, dividing the labor. And a number of the things Rorty says in that first half of the essay are interpretable in Carnapian terms. He's saying, look, not everything, particularly that you philosophers care about, is happily thought of as a matter of deciding what's true in a fixed vocabulary. Many of the issues are about which vocabulary you ought to deploy. And those are going to answer to a different kind of norm than decisions about what to say in a fixed vocabulary. And those are all things that Carnap could say already. If we're distinguishing the norms internal to a vocabulary, holding the vocabulary fixed, from what considerations come into play, what norms govern a choice of vocabularies if you're changing them. And I think it would be disappointing if Rorty were backsliding here and there was nothing more than Carnapian pragmatism in play. And I think we need not be disappointed there. I read these remarks that can be understood in the Carnapian way as rhetorical softening up devices. He's saying, look, even if you're not with me in the post-Quinean world of vocabularies, still, even as a Carnapian, you see that you don't want to think about your choice of language as reflecting something in the world. Later on, this thought will come up in the form of his making fun of the idea that representational realists of a certain kind are committed to there being such a thing as nature's own language, nature's own vocabulary, that we're trying to find the boundaries of. If you think of his discussion of David Lewis, for instance, in the later pieces, he sees Lewis as committed to there being nature's own vocabulary, the one that determines what the intrinsic properties, the natural properties in Lewis's terms are. But there is an important point being made here in the Carnapian terms when we apply the Quinean lesson. On Rorty's picture, there isn't going to be a line to be drawn between speaking within one vocabulary and altering your vocabulary. Almost everything you say, he thinks, alters the meanings of the words to some degree or other. I mentioned last time that one of the arguments that's doing a lot of work for Quine is what he called the do-hem point, that if we acknowledge that your meanings ought to at least determine what implications are good, what inferences are good, and then do-hem reminds us that what follows from a given sentence depends on what auxiliary hypotheses you're allowed to use as collateral premises for it. Then if we think of the meanings as inferential roles, the meaning of a sentence as inferential roles, what follows from it, what would be evidence for it and against it, then we can see that what else you're committed to has an effect on the meaning of that sentence. And so Rorty's going to say, well, every time you say something, every time you commit yourself to something, that has an effect on the meanings of your words. We can't separate speaking within one vocabulary from transforming that vocabulary, moving in the direction of a different vocabulary. And here, I think he has a picture of the effort that's required in mature sciences to hold a vocabulary sufficiently fixed that there can be agreed upon procedures for deciding who's right and who's wrong about particular claims or particular inferences. On this view, mature sciences struggle constantly to provide and maintain discursive environments that are artificial and extreme. You might think about them as the discursive equivalent of clean rooms, where normal science can be pursued, and the issue of changing the meaning of the terms can be kept at bay or at least postponed. That this process of what Heidegger in Being and Time talks about as the effort of precipitating presence at hand out of readiness to hand, Vorhandenheit out of Zuhandenheit, finding institutional ways of regimenting the discourse so that you can briefly institute the artificial conditions under which change of meaning isn't something you need to worry about. But insofar as a science is not mature, sort of everything you discover is going to be changing the meanings of the terms. If you think about the history of a concept like temperature, every time somebody discovered a new way of measuring temperature or a new theoretical consequence of differences of temperature, the concept evolved. Rorty says This is from the Introduction to Consequences of Pragmatism. It's on the handout. On the pragmatist account, a criterion, what follows from the axioms, what the needle points to, what the statute says, a criterion is a criterion because some particular social practice needs to block the road of inquiry, halt the regress of interpretations in order to get something done. So rigorous argumentation, the practice that's made possible by agreement on criteria, on stopping places, is no more generally desirable than blocking the road of inquiry is generally desirable. Blocking the road of inquiry is Peirce's catchphrase. It's something which it's convenient to have if you can get it. If the purposes you're engaged in fulfilling can be specified pretty clearly in advance, for instance, finding out how an enzyme functions, preventing violence in the streets, proving theorems, then you can get it. If they're not, as in the search for a just society, the resolution of a moral dilemma, the choice of a symbol of ultimate concern, or the quest for a postmodernist sensibility, then you probably cannot, and you shouldn't try for it. And if what you're interested in is philosophy, you certainly will not get it, he says. For one of the things which the various philosophies for describing things differ about is the purpose of describing things. And the philosopher will not want to beg the question between these various descriptions in advance. Now that's an argument that I said it seemed to me could be conducted largely in the Carnapian framework. He's, insofar as the issue is changing the discourse, one's going to be a pragmatist rather than a Platonist, but it's inflected in the Quinean way. Now, there's two other concepts that he deploys in connection with the notion of a vocabulary. And this is the notion of redescription, which is what you do when you move to a different vocabulary, and conversation. Here, an index utterance, an index claim about the notion of conversation, again, all these quotes will be on the handout, is from the Pragmatism, Relativism, and Irrationalism essay. He says, pragmatists follow Hegel in saying that philosophy is its time grasped in thought. Anti-pragmatists follow Plato in striving for an escape from conversation to something atemporal which lies in the background of all possible conversations. So one of the uses that he wants to make of this notion of conversation is to metaphilosophically distinguish two philosophical traditions, one of whose ideal is to continue the conversation for its own sake, and those whose ideal, as he polemically wants to put it, the point of what we're doing is to end the conversation or make it unnecessary because you find the final vocabulary. And for him, Socrates is the avatar of those for whom not just the good for philosophers, but the good for human beings is conversation. And Plato, with his distinctive reading of what Socrates is doing, is the avatar of looking for the final vocabulary, the one that will make further conversation unnecessary. Now, this is savagely unfair to Plato. He's being used as a cartoon figure here, but I'm trying to sketch the framework that Rorty's going to deploy his rhetoric in. So we'll see him using the idea of conversation as always involving not just using the vocabulary you've got to describe things, but using the expressive capacities of our discourse to re-describe things, to come up with new ways of describing things. And I think one way of characterizing what Rorty thinks is the fundamental mistake, anyway, a fundamental mistake, that his pragmatism is supposed to guard against, is drawing any philosophical conclusion that requires you to quantify over all possible vocabularies. The idea of all possible vocabularies, he thinks, is one you could only have if you aspired to the end of conversation. The end of the conversation, where he's thinking of conversation as something that intrinsically and essentially throws up new ways to describe things, brings out different ways that we could talk and think. And at the very idea that there's a well-defined set of all possible vocabularies is a fundamental mistake. And I'm going to say something about this thought as it comes up in the early Wittgenstein, who absolutely is quantifying over all possible vocabularies in the Tractatus, and this as a core lesson that the later Wittgenstein has learned, and is one of the things that he's rigorously thinking through. This is behind the later Wittgenstein's thinking of language as a motley. And it's behind his hostility to the idea of theorizing in philosophy. Dummett, I think, usefully describes the later Wittgenstein as thinking that if there were any use for a philosophical notion of meaning, the point of having a notion of meaning would be to codify proprieties of use, of practice, to be a theoretical idiom in which you could say, could describe the practices that we have, describe the roles that expressions can play in our practices, in virtue of which they have the meaning that they do. But the thought would be, if you could systematically assign meanings to the expressions, then you could begin to botanize and systematize different ways you could use those meanings, different things you could do with them. But Wittgenstein thinks there is no totality of things you can do with them. Language is a motley. This is his favorite place to use the analogy with tools. He'd say you would think that you could describe the different ways of using things in terms of what you do with them in the way you could tools, so that you could think of hammer and nails, screw and screwdriver, glue and glue brush, all as ways of attaching things to one another. And that would be a sort of common function that they could perform. And he thinks of his earlier self as thinking, yes, representation is like that. That's what language is for, and it can be done in different ways, but we can talk about the essence of representation. But there are other kinds of tools. What about a wrench? What about the pencil that the carpenter uses, or the level that the carpenter uses, or the tool belt or tool chest, or the set of plans that they're using? All these are functioning differently, and there isn't going to be a systematic way of saying all the different kinds of tools that you could have. Now, in the discursive case, why is that? And here, this is a lesson I learned from Hans Julius Schneider, his book Fantasie und Kalkül, about the early and the later Wittgenstein, that the later Wittgenstein thinks language is an unsurveyable motley because he thinks discursive practice is essentially plastic, that everything you do in accord with a linguistic practice alters it, so that the most that a systematizing of language could give you is a snapshot of it. Freezing a moment in time, you could systematize things, but as the practices go on, they're going to change the way things are done. So if we think about classic Wittgensteinian anecdotes, they turn on the malleability and plasticity of language. He says, we used to talk about one object being in another. We could say, I have gold in my teeth. And it always made sense to ask, where was the gold before it was in your teeth? But now it turns out we start talking about having pain in my teeth. And we can do that. We can catch on to this new way of using in, talking about pain in bodily parts. It turns out we can catch on. No guarantee we could, but it turns out we do. That's an alteration of our practice. And now certain questions don't make sense anymore. We can't ask, where was the pain before it was in your tooth? And he thinks if you have a static picture of language, there's a distinctive kind of puzzlement you can have, a distinctive metaphysical puzzlement. Well, aren't pains peculiar sorts of things then compared to gold? Or again, he imagines that we started off only using names for people, and then we started to extend them and use names also for rivers. Well, for people, it always made sense to ask of any nameable, well, who was their parents? But now when we apply this to the rivers, there's no answer to that question. And again, there's the possibility of this distinctively metaphysical puzzlement about what peculiar things rivers are. That's just the shadow of the way we used to talk. And Wittgenstein's thought is that that sort of extension, using proper names for in different ways than we used them before, different kinds of objects, using the preposition, using in a different way, that's of the essence of language. It's plastic in that way. It's always overflowing itself. And so it's an unsurveyable motley. That's why Wittgenstein is a semantic nihilist. He doesn't think there are such things as meanings. The meanings would let us systematically derive proprieties of use from assignments of meanings, but the plasticity of language makes that impossible. Well, those are redescriptions in the Rortyan way, and to think of redescription, the generation of new vocabularies, as of the essence of discursive practice, is to be committed to a view of conversation as something that you're committed to continuing, rather than seeking to end by finding the best, the final, nature's own vocabulary, the one that would describe things correctly. And here, there's a connection between the notion of a vocabulary and the notion of a fact. Different kinds of facts are identified and individuated by the vocabularies we use to state them. Physical facts are facts that are statable in the vocabulary of physics. Normative facts, what you state if you use a declarative sentence like it's wrong to torture helpless strangers, normative facts are facts stated in a normative vocabulary. And similarly, we understand culinary facts or nautical facts in terms of the vocabularies in which they can be stated. And Rorty concludes, if it doesn't make sense to quantify over all possible vocabularies, then it doesn't make sense to quantify over all possible facts. Because any new vocabulary is going to make it possible to state new facts. Here we can think about the third proposition of the Tractatus, 1.11. The world is determined by the facts, and by these being all the facts. Already we've gotten something in the Tractatus that is absolutely unsayable according to the theory of the Tractatus. What do you mean, there being all the facts? That's something like, well, there aren't any more facts that aren't in here. That's not a picturable situation, that negative existential. There are no facts except this set of facts. You can't picture that in Tractarian terms. That's a paradigmatic instance of the kind of thing that he will later on say, well, but if you understand my lesson, you see that the things I've said in the Tractatus are not sayable. So it's going to be important to Rorty to justify the claim that there is no definite totality of vocabularies, that that's an ultimately confused notion. And it's going to be a constant strategy of his to see an implicit commitment to the intelligibility of that notion, to diagnose that in his opponents. That's one of the pragmatist strategies that he's employing. Second thing, or further thing about which I'll have more to say later on, he is willing to allow a pragmatist analog of the normative vocabulary that representationalists use to compare different representational schemes. Remember, one of the things he objected to in the representationalist tradition he was attacking in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature was the notion of the commensurability of different representational schemes. We could always ask, is this more accurate? Does this more accurately represent the way things objectively are than this other scheme does? If you're a Tractarian, if you think the generic task of language is to represent how things are, to let us describe, to let us say how things are, then he thinks that that automatically comes with a normative language of representing it better, a more accurate representation. And that's going to mislead epistemology, because the notion of justification, those norms are going to be read off ultimately assessments of accuracy of representation. And he thinks that gets justification completely wrong. But he is willing to talk about an analog. What do we do with vocabularies? We cope, he says. We cope with each other and we cope with our environment. And one of the things we're going to want to look at is, and this will be particularly relevant in connection with this discussion of Davidson, is how to understand that notion of coping. So I mean to put on the table the notion of a vocabulary, of redescription, of conversation, and at least to put on the table the idea that what's driving a number of Rorty's arguments is the idea that the notion of a well-defined determinate totality of all possible vocabularies is a fundamentally confused one. That anytime your way of thinking about our languages, our mindedness, commits you to the idea of a determinate, in principle, surveyable totality of all possible schemes of representation, descriptions, vocabularies generally, that indicates you've made a fundamental mistake. And pragmatism is supposed to avoid that mistake and diagnose it in other approaches. Let me stop there to invite comments or questions. Yeah, Katja.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is Rorty a pluralist about vocabularies, or is he just thinking about one vocabulary which is constantly changing? Because I was thinking about the notion of incommensurability. What would he say to Kuhn, for example? Because Kuhn also thinks about changing vocabularies which are changing with the paradigms. And in that case, there is no bridge across these paradigms and across the vocabularies. The conversation has to stop. So when one aim of Rorty is the continuing of conversation, then incommensurability would stop it. But he also cannot come to something like commensurability, because this would lead to a representation.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. And I think there's tensions in Rorty. On the one hand, he absolutely has Kuhn in mind. Kuhn is writing at Princeton, literally just down the hall from Rorty's office when he's writing The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and Rorty is thinking of Kuhn as having deployed the vocabulary here. On the other side, Rorty endorses Davidson's invocation of charity as part of his interpretivist methodology that says if you're talking about a total vocabulary, what I call an autonomous discursive practice, a discursive practice you could engage in, though you engaged in no other, there has to be the possibility of conversation, the possibility of reciprocal interpretation, even though doing that is going to change both of the vocabularies. So I think his resolution of it is of this tension between the Kuhnian incommensurability and the Davidsonian principle of charity as part of the interpretationist methodology that says what it is for somebody to be engaging in a discursive practice is for their practice to be mappable onto yours, in effect, in a way that permits conversation. That apart from that possibility, you can't even make sense of the idea that they're talking. Rorty's World Well Lost, that was a supplementary thing, is his making this argument that the Kuhnian incommensurability is always for more restricted vocabularies, and ones that are not autonomous vocabularies, but are addressed to particular subject matters or in some other way embedded in and parasitic on these larger common things. But this is pointing to one crucial flexibility, at any rate, in the notion of a vocabulary. Sort of, how big are they? I mean, he wants to talk about, on the one hand, the vocabulary of 16th century theology, but also the vocabulary of modernity, where that's presumably an autonomous discursive practice, and the theological vocabulary isn't. So we should at least be on guard about this capacious character of the notion of vocabulary. Some of the things he says may not be true of autonomous vocabularies, or may not be true of the more local vocabularies. Yeah, Thomas.
Hi, Bob. So we're talking about redescription and conversation. How does Rorty understand description, if not representationally? Because very flat-footedly, I don't have a conception of description, I don't think, that isn't representational. That seems to be the paradigm of representing. So how is he, if this notion of redescription is going to be central, then I'm assuming description is as well. So what is describing then?
Yeah, well, I think you're putting your finger on an infelicity in his vocabulary, because he with his hero Sellers doesn't want to be a descriptivist, and he doesn't want to claim that's all we do with the language. And yet here, the redescription is a convenient term for him to use, meaning deploying a different vocabulary to make assertions. And there's a kind of declarativism that's in play here, that's saying, well, it's essential to discursive practice that some speech acts have the form of assertions, and whatever expressions the utterance or production of which it is has that pragmatic significance, those are going to count as declarative sentences, and we're going to take them then, this is the declarativist move, to be in the fact-stating line of work. They may not state facts because they might not be true, but at least they're purporting to, when everything is felicitous, that's what they do. And so when we think about every vocabulary having a correlative range of facts, the nautical or culinary facts corresponding to the vocabulary, we're thinking about those fact-stating uses. And I think Rorty would say he doesn't want to say anything more than that about description. And indeed, the idea that in using normative vocabulary, one is describing or representing how things are. That's the narrow descriptivist claim that Sellers rejects, that Rorty would reject as well. So it would be this declarativist version.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, Sellers keeps some notion of representation, right? He doesn't go the whole hog.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is why Rorty couldn't persuade Sellers that he was a pragmatist, because he said, no, this notion of picturing has to do some work. We have to keep this notion. And Rorty himself allows something like that. Yeah. Again, from that first essay, the Pragmatism, Relativism, and Irrationalism, Rorty says, to say that the parts of properly analyzed true sentences are arranged in a way isomorphic to parts of the world paired with them sounds plausible if one thinks of a sentence like Jupiter has moons. It sounds slightly less plausible for the Earth goes around the sun. Less, for there is no such thing as natural motion, and not at all plausible, for the universe is infinite. When we want to praise or blame assertions of the latter sort of sentence, we show how the decision to assert them fits into a whole complex of decisions about what terminology to use, what books to read, what projects to engage in, and what life to live. In this respect, they resemble such sentences as love is the only law, and history is the story of class struggle. The whole vocabulary of isomorphism, picturing, and mapping is out of place here, as indeed is the notion of being true of objects. If we ask what objects these sentences claim to be true of, or represent, we get only unhelpful repetitions of the subject terms, the universe, the law, history, or even less helpfully, we get talk about the facts, or the way the world is. Now, that passage makes it sound as though he's saying, well, the representation talk is fine for ordinary empirical descriptive, the frog is on the log sort of talk. And the mistake is to think that you can use that as a model for all the things that we do with declarative sentences. When we're saying things like patience is a virtue, he says, now the representational model is not helping you in understanding that. The model of the frog is on the log fades out, no matter how much you twist it when you're thinking about statements like that. But that is a reason not to use representation as your general model. And say, well, to say something is to represent the world as being some way, because there are these cases of saying, even important sayings, we worry about whether history is the story of the class struggle. I mean, maybe that isn't true, but we need to worry about claims like that. Okay, pointing out that this model has to be tortured, that it would be a Procrustean application of the model to all of these sentences. That's a good argument against global representationalism, using this model everywhere. But it's not a good argument for global anti-representationalism, for saying, no, you should just never think about things in representational terms. When the metaphilosophical setting for this shifts over to the expressivism, this is the question of whether you should say, well, look, some expressions we have to think of non-representationally. Maybe normative expressions are like that. Interesting question, whether probabilistic statements belong on the frog is on the log side or on the patience is a virtue side. But, you know, we can have room for representational idioms and for vocabularies that are in the representational line of work. And one of the things that's fascinating about Hugh Price in the generation after Rorty is he wants to say, no, these considerations actually support a global anti-representationalism. Again, Rorty is softening us up here. You know, this is where his argument begins, not where the argument ends. But we're going to have constantly in mind this alternative that says, yeah, it's not a great, you shouldn't use representation as the model for talking or even for claiming generally. But it doesn't follow that it's not the right way to think about some of these things. Rorty and Price are going to deny that. And that's a very radical position to take. I mean, in fact, Rorty wants to deny a whole host of distinctions. Here's some passages from the presidential address. So a second characterization of pragmatism might go like this. There's no epistemological difference between truth about what ought to be and truth about what is, nor any metaphysical difference between facts and values, nor any methodological difference between morality and science. Or again, in the anti-representationalism, ethnocentrism, and liberalism essay right at the beginning, he says, by an anti-representationalist account, I mean one which does not view knowledge as a matter of getting reality right, but rather as a matter of acquiring habits of action for coping with reality. The papers in this volume argue that such an account makes it unnecessary to draw Dilthey-like distinctions between explaining hard phenomena and interpreting soft ones. That is, the distinction between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, between Verstehen and Erklären in Dilthey's terms. They offer an account of inquiry which recognizes sociological, but not epistemological, or he could say semantic differences between such disciplinary matrices as theoretical physics and literary criticism. Now, this is what I want to call his anti-bifurcationism. The bifurcation is Hugh Price's word, and I'm somewhat anachronistically applying it to Rorty here. That is, the pragmatist view is supposed to undercut a bunch of important, one would have thought, essential semantic and epistemological distinctions between saying how things are in the natural sciences and saying how they ought to be in our moral theories. He's going to say there is no different relation between the saying and the facts that are stated in those two cases. Or if I make literary claims about the transformation of poetic ideals that Eliot's Wasteland affected on the one hand, and claims about the weight of the electron on the other. He's saying the relation they stand in to what they're about is not fundamentally different. There's no need in either case to worry about what makes it true. What you should think about is the reason relations that they stand in to other claims. The relations of implication and exclusion that we appeal to in giving reasons and assessing reasons in these areas. And there we will find sociological differences between the reason-giving practices. But what we must resist, he's claiming, is to think that those correspond to metaphysical differences in the things we're talking about. That last step would be the representationalist misconstrual, misdescription of what's going on. So here's some more passages. I think these are not on the handout because I didn't include anything from the Dewey and Heidegger essay, the Overcoming the Tradition essay, which is sort of, well, anyway. So, but here are two passages from that. Both Dewey and Heidegger abhor the notion that poetry is supposed to offer us values as opposed to something else, facts, which we're to find in science. Both regard the fact-value distinction as springing from and as dangerous as the subject-object distinction. Heidegger thinks the whole notion of values is an awkward attempt by the metaphysician to supply an additional Vorhanden, something present at hand, in order to make good the deficiency left by thinking of being or idea as Vorstellung, as representation, an afterthought that's necessary to round out the ontology of the world. That's from page 292 of the Overcoming Tradition essay. And then again, Dewey wants the tradition overcome by blurring all the distinctions it's drawn. In particular, Dewey wants the distinctions between science and philosophy to be rubbed out and replaced with an uncontroversial notion of intelligence trying to solve problems and provide meanings. I mean, Rorty somewhere characterizes Dewey as using the notion of experience as an incantatory device to blur every conceivable distinction. And he's thinking particularly of Dewey in Experience and Nature, which I think of as Dewey's best work. Rorty, though, is using the notion of a vocabulary and this affiliated constellation of notions to blur, if not every conceivable distinction, at any rate, a bunch of really important ones. This is a kind of promiscuous anti-bifurcationism. And if we think about the Dilthey distinction between the Geisteswissenschaften and the Naturwissenschaften, Dilthey is saying they are the sort of understanding that you have of texts, of sayings, things that can be said, is different. In principle, it's different from the kind of understanding you can have only of stuff that doesn't talk, stuff that isn't talking. That the division between the kind of understanding appropriate to discourse, discursive products, is in principle different from the kind of understanding appropriate to sort of middle-sized bits of dry goods whizzing about in space. And I, for one, think, yes, that's a deep insight. We've got to think about those two different kinds of understanding. Think about the way we give reasons and justify a claim about what somebody or some text means from the way we give reasons for a prediction about what will happen if the bird lands on that branch. Rorty here is saying, no, there can be sociological differences. The structure of the giving and the practices of giving and assessing reasons can be different in particular ways in law courts than in the physicists' laboratories or in the practice of the literary critic and the practice of the population biologist. But those do not correspond to semantic differences. They do not express semantic differences in how those statements latch onto something in the world or something that they're about. To think that is to use a Procrustean representationalist model. And that's an extremely radical claim. This is the point at which I think one wants to say, yeah, Rorty, you've gone too far. I could go along with you some of the way, but this is just pushing these ideas too far. And it's a striking fact that almost every sympathetic reader of Rorty ends up thinking that he's gone too far, even though we differ quite a bit in where it is that we think he's stepped over the line. And I think this makes urgent the reconstructive task of figuring out, well, just what are the arguments that he's motivated by? What are the insights that he's expressing? But I think we ought to be in awe of the philosophical courage with which he follows the ideas where they lead him and embraces the conclusions, sort of rigorously drawing out what he sees as following from the fundamental considerations, long after other people's compass has switched from modus ponens to modus tollens. He's still extracting consequences, following the lines of thought where they may. And one of the things we'll have to be sorting out as we go forward is exactly where does he go too far? Where is he mistakenly drawing a conclusion from what I think, I certainly think there are underlying good ideas here. On the other hand, the places that he gets to when he rigorously follows these consequences out, as he has the eyes to see them, of course, are often very unpalatable positions. And now I'm not talking about meta-philosophically unpalatable, thinking no one should do capital P philosophy anymore. I'm talking about philosophically unpalatable conclusions. For instance, the impropriety of a semantic and epistemological distinction between the kind of understanding that is appropriate to texts and things that can talk on the one hand, and the kind of understanding that's appropriate to things that can't talk on the other hand. So I want to start off by walking through some of the dialectic as I see it in connection with Rorty's discussion of truth that he starts off that presidential address with. And here he's contrasting two broad conceptions: truth as correspondence with reality, the representational notion, and truth as what is best in the way of belief, or what is good in the way of belief, in William James' phrase, that is the slogan for the pragmatist version. Correspondence with reality is a modern representationalist reading of Aristotle's saying of what is that it is and of what is not that it is not. But Rorty sees the Aristotelian formulation as just a platitude and not as colliding with James' conception. He thinks James can say, oh yeah, we're saying of what is that it is and of what is not that it's not as well. But this conception of truth as what's best in the way of belief is what underwrites this assimilationism, the anti-bifurcationism that he has. Normative statements, legal statements, hermeneutic statements can be true just the same way ordinary empirical descriptive, frog is on a log, statements can be. They're true in the very same sense in which natural scientific statements are true. They are no less true. They are every bit as true in that shared sense as the OED claims, the ordinary empirical descriptive claims, and the scientific claims are. And as I indicated before the break, I think this depends on a universal declarativism about truth. It says any discourse that admits declarative sentences, any vocabulary that permits the formulation of declarative sentences, is going to produce those declarative sentences as truth evaluable, as subject to assessment as to their truth. So here are some, so it's saying whatever you can put in the form of a declarative sentence is going to admit of truth assessments in the very same sense, the only sense that matters. And that's why they're semantically on a par. And though the differences in the modes of justification, there may be differences in the modes of justification, those won't underwrite fundamental epistemological differences either. So here's some passages that are on the handout from the introduction to Consequences of Pragmatism. It says, pragmatism cuts across this transcendental empirical distinction by questioning the common presupposition that there's an invidious distinction to be drawn between different kinds of truths. So here's the anti-bifurcationism. For the pragmatist, true sentences are not true because they correspond to reality. And so there's no need to worry what sort of reality, if any, a given sentence corresponds to. No need to worry about what makes it true. So here, think of Armstrong's idiom of truth makers, looking for the truth makers. Again, he says, for pragmatists, truth is just the name of a property which all true statements share. Pragmatists doubt that there's much to be said about this common feature. Or again, pragmatists think that the history of attempts to isolate the true or the good, or define the words true or good, support their suspicion that there's no interesting work to be done in this area. It might, of course, have turned out to be otherwise. I think he means an epistemic possibility, not a metaphysical one. They might have found something interesting to say about the essence of truth, but in fact they haven't. So pragmatists see the Platonic tradition as having outlived its usefulness. This doesn't mean that the pragmatists have a new non-Platonic set of answers to Platonic questions to offer, but rather that they do not think we should ask those questions anymore. They would simply like to change the subject. Or again, from the presidential address, my first characterization of pragmatism is that it is simply anti-essentialism applied to notions like truth, knowledge, language, morality, and similar objects of philosophical theorizing. Here we can ask, here a thing to ask is, if you say that a claim is true, what kind of speech act are you performing? Are you describing it as having a certain property? The way you're describing the frog as being on the log. A substantive representationalist correspondence theory aims to answer yes and tell you what property, what sort of isomorphism you're asserting between, or more general representational relation you're asserting obtains between the facts, the truth makers, paradigmatically objective ones, the representeds, and the claimings, the representings that are true. One way of defending a James type account, truth is what's good in the way of belief, of the sort that Rorty's espousing, is to say that characterizing a claimable as true, what one's doing in doing that is not describing it. What you're doing is endorsing it. And that's doing something else. That's taking up a distinctive kind of normative stance towards it. A view like that is a kind of expressivism about truth. Think of the meta-ethical expressivists, Stevenson, Ayer, and so on, who say, look, in saying that something is good, you're not describing it. You're commending it. You're doing something else. This connection with expressivism is going to be important to get us from the Rorty portion of the course to the Hugh Price portion of the course. This is a local expressivism about true and truth, about those locutions. But this kind of expressivism, though in one sense it's a local expressivism, because of the peculiarity of the concept of truth, it gives aid and comfort to a global anti-representationalism. Because true can be applied to all declarative sentences. So if you combine this sort of local expressivism about true, what you're doing in calling some claim true is not describing it, for instance, as standing in a certain relation to what makes it true, to the fact. You're doing something else. You're endorsing it. That can be applied to all declarative sentences. If you combine that expressivism about true with a universal declarativism, then you get a single notion of truth that applies to all these different kinds of vocabularies, to the normative, to the literary, and so on. This kind of assimilationism is the product, I'm saying, of universal declarativism and local expressivism about truth. On this view, when you call something true, you don't describe it, you're doing something like commending it, endorsing it, you're taking up a normative stance to it. That's one reading of James saying it's what's good in the way of belief, if you read the good in an expressivist way. Saying a claimable is true is approving of it as good in the same way that I can approve a knife as good of its kind, if it's sharp and has a comfortable handle, or a racehorse as being good of its kind, if it's fast relative to other horses over the right distance. But nonetheless, what I'm doing is commending it, approving it, endorsing it. This is a way of understanding what Rorty means when he says that calling something true is paying it an empty compliment that's appropriate wherever portions of Quine's web of belief are currently stable, so we're willing to endorse them, or where whatever planks of Neurath's boat we're currently leaving in place as not in need of repair. This is a common Rorty trope to say, to call something true is just an empty compliment. That status is indeed promiscuously available across all vocabularies that admit of declaratives, the normative, legal, and literary. Now we could say, look, when I say it's true that P, I don't mean I endorse the claim that P, or I believe that P. It's true that whenever I can say it's true that P, I could say I believe that P, but still isn't there a difference in meaning between these? It's exactly when I'm justified in claiming that it's true that P, that I'm justified in expressing my belief that P, saying I believe it, I endorse it, but that's not enough to say they mean the same. Now, here's what Rorty says about this. Again, this is somewhere on the handout. What really needs debate between the pragmatist and the intuitive realist is not whether we have intuitions to the effect that truth is more than assertability, or there's more to pains than brain states, or there's a clash between modern physics and our sense of moral responsibility. Of course we have such intuitions, he says. How could we escape having them? We've been educated within an intellectual tradition built around such claims. Just as we used to be educated within an intellectual tradition built around such claims as, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Man's dignity consists in his link with a supernatural order, and one must not mock holy things. But it begs the question between the pragmatist and the realist to say that we must find a philosophical view that captures such intuitions. The pragmatist is urging that we do our best to stop having such intuitions, that we develop a new intellectual tradition. That's the end of the quote. He's suggesting pragmatism as a way of training ourselves out of these intuitions. Okay, that's one move I'm suggesting we can see in helping to understand what could be behind these radical things Rorty is saying about the nature of truth. Yeah, Thomas?
This is interesting because I was a bit confused. I like this is the APA paper, right? Or no? Which one is?
I think this is the anti-representationalism paper.
Right.
Yeah.
The first quote you read there, I think it's the second one on the handout from this paper. Am I right as reading that? Two things. Am I right as reading it? One is basically telling you what the thrust of the argument of the whole paper is, and two, that it's kind of like a pessimistic meta-induction over the history of philosophy rather than the history of science?
Yes.
Okay.
And I mean, there's various places here where he makes exactly that distinction and says, look, I'm not talking about scientific theories, I'm talking about philosophical theories. Mm-hmm. That's the one I'm skeptical about. Okay, so the first suggestion I've been making is how we can sort of see some sense behind, or see what the line of thought might be behind this, is an expressivism about truth combined with putting all the declaratives in one box, and then say, well, all of them are truth evaluable in that they grammatically admit the claim that this is true, that this declarative sentence is true. And if we combine that with the view that what you're doing in doing that is not describing it, but endorsing it, then we get the consequences that he's given us. Now, does this require saying that the content of my claim, it is true that P, is the same as the content of the claim, I endorse the claim that P, or I believe that P? Rorty, in that passage that I just read, says, well, you have the intuition that those are different, that it is true that P, and I treat P as assertable. These are not all exactly the same, but for present purposes, we can lump them together. He says we have the intuition that those are different, but read pragmatism long enough and read my pragmatism long enough, and I'll teach you not to have those intuitions. This, by the way, doesn't seem to work, but that's the hope that we would stop. But I think we can actually do better than that. And here's the way I would reconcile this sort of expressivism about truth, a local expressivism, but that has global consequences when you combine it with declarativism. Think about what you're doing when you say that somebody knows that P, when you're attributing knowledge to somebody. Now, on good old-fashioned JTB analyses of knowledge, you're attributing a justified true belief. Now, attributing a belief, if we think of it in sort of pragmatist normative terms, you're attributing a commitment to somebody. A justified belief, you're attributing entitlement to it. You're saying they're entitled to this commitment. What are you doing when you say it's true? Well, the key thing to understand is you're not attributing any normative status to them. You're undertaking a normative status. You're undertaking the commitment to P yourself. You're expressing your willingness to use it as a premise in your own reasoning, your willingness to assert it. What's peculiar about the property of truth is a consequence of your grammatically misunderstanding in the pragmatics now. What you're doing when you say, in addition to this being a justified belief, it's a true belief, thinking that because when you say it's a belief, you're attributing a normative status, a commitment, and when you say it's justified, you're attributing a normative status, entitlement, that when you say it's true, you must be attributing something to it. And in fact, you're not. You're doing something else. You're endorsing it yourself. You're undertaking a commitment, not attributing one. Now, that's saying that there's a difference between attributing a belief and attributing truth. Those are two different things. We can see that they come apart in attributions of knowledge. I might take somebody to have endorsed something and take it not to be true. Now, it's a consequence of that, that in my own case, if I'm talking about my contemporaneous commitments, I'll take it that P is true just in case I endorse P. That's true. But because in the third person case, these can come apart, I can think about my own case that way too. I can say, well, it could be the case that though I endorse P, I ought not, because it isn't true. I'm thinking about taking up this third person perspective to my own current self. And so I can see a difference between endorsing the claim, what I'm saying, the content of saying I endorse the claim, and the content of what I'm saying when I say it's true. I understand the difference between those because I understand it in your case, or in the case of my past self, my possible my future self, or my possible current self. The belief condition and the truth condition can come apart in attributions of knowledge. That's enough to underwrite. It's more than just an intuition. I do mean different things by saying it's true that P than by saying I endorse or believe that P. Nonetheless, what I'm doing when I say it's true is just endorsing it. That's the fundamental pragmatic equivalence of claiming that P and claiming that P is true. Furthermore, we can turn the crank one more time. So I've said two things: that you can get a rationale for Rorty's endorsement of the James picture if you combine a universal declarativism with a local expressivism about true. The idea that in calling something true, you're doing something different than describing it. You're endorsing it. And I say that's compatible with there being a difference in meaning between the claim, it is true that P, and I endorse the claim that P. We can see that if we think about the difference of social perspective between attributing a commitment and undertaking it, that's essentially involved in attributions of knowledge. But when I first introduced the topic of expressivism, I indicated that the difference between, that what distinguishes first wave metaethical expressivism from second wave metaethical expressivism is the Geach-Frege argument from embedding that any expressivism that's going to be adequate has to account not only for freestanding uses of the expression, but for embedded uses as well. That's what distinguishes the metaethical expressivism of Blackburn and Gibbard from the previous generation, is taking seriously handling embedded uses of normative vocabulary. And they do it by saying, well, these things do have content, propositional content. They are declarative sentences. They can be true or false, but we have to understand that content is derivative from the speech act you're performing when you assert one in a freestanding way. And they tell different stories about that. Well, this challenge of explaining not only freestanding uses of true, when I say it is true that P, what the witness says is true, I'm endorsing it. In addition to those, we have to look at embedded cases. Well, if that's true, then you should probably publish it as the antecedent of a conditional. I'm not endorsing it there. How can we understand that? This is the challenge of contemporary deflationary theories of truth. The redundancy theory of truth that's due to Ramsey, who is one of Cheryl Misak's paradigmatic pragmatists. The elaboration of that into the minimalist theory of truth of Paul Horich. And I've argued that a development of the prosentential theory of truth, prosentential theory of truth started in Pittsburgh in the early 70s, and which I've elaborated in various places, in particular in the articles Pragmatism, Phenomenalism, and Truth Talk, and explanatory versus expressive deflationism about truth, both of which you can find in the texts available section on my website. At any rate, the constraint, the criteria of adequacy for contemporary deflationary theories of truth is precisely to answer the Frege-Geach objection, and so warrant a local expressivism about truth that says, look, the key thing to understand about true is that what you're doing in saying something's true is endorsing it, not describing it. So I think if you add this social perspectival story about the role of truth in knowledge attributions, and so see the basis of the difference in meaning between the claim P is true and I endorse the claim that P, and then handle the embedded uses in my pro-sentence forming operator way, or one of these other minimalist deflationary accounts, you can get an adequate account of the uses of true that underwrite the sort of conclusions that Rorty is drawing from the James theory. That doesn't make everything okay, because there's still a question, well, but isn't there some representation going on here? Truth is not the only thing we want the notion of representation for. Here are some passages. Yeah. So he says, and this will now be from the anti-representationalism essay. So at the end of the handout. But for Davidson, reflection on what a belief is not the analysis of representation. Rather, it's a reflection on how a language-using organism interacts with what's going on in its neighborhood. Like Dewey, Davidson takes off from Darwin rather than from Descartes, from beliefs as adaptations to the environment rather than as quasi-pictures. This is what the talk about coping came to. Now, I need to say some more about this coping alternative to the analysis of representation when we're talking about beliefs. Should we think about beliefs as and now we're talk about truth to one side. I suggested a line of thought where we can do that, but still here he's saying what Davidson's right about is that to think about what belief is not to do something properly called an analysis of representation. It's to do something else, to think about it as coping with its environment. Well, Rorty sometimes gives the impression, and here the Invocation of Darwin does, that he's going to give a reductive, biologically naturalistic account of belief, of something being good in the way of belief, being good for the survival or reproductive fitness of the organism. And when Rorty has his naturalist's hat on, he makes noises like that. He's thinking of a sort of evolutionary psychology picture, the sort of role in selectional processes, the assimilation of the selectional process of evolution and of learning that got Peirce started. But though Rorty is tempted by that line of thought and sometimes talks that way, the Invocation of Davidson, I think, is crucial here, because Davidson urges that we think about belief in interpretivist terms, that to say someone is a believer is to invoke the possibility of interpreting their behavior by attributing meanings and beliefs together, taking their states to have propositional contents, in the sense that they stand in reason relations to one another. They imply each other, are evidence for each other, can justify each other, can exclude and be evidence against each other in a way that can be mapped on to to the reason relations that articulate our commitments, so as to permit us to talk to them, to make sense of them, to have a conversation with them. And the important thing, one important thing here is Davidson is not saying that's how you find out what somebody believes, though it is. He's saying that's what it means to say somebody means this by their utterance or believes this. It's that the best overall interpretation of their behavior, verbal and nonverbal, would take the form of attributing a whole constellation of beliefs and meanings to them. The alternative that Rorty wants to offer to thinking in representational terms about beliefs is thinking about them as meaning what they do in virtue of the reason relations that they stand in to all your other commitments and possible commitments. The ones that make conversation possible, that make it possible for others to make sense of your behavior by attributing sample pieces of reasoning that rationalize what you're doing. So here's a passage that asserts this and offers an important caution against misunderstanding. This is from page 6 of the introduction to The Consequences of Pragmatism. This Davidsonian way of looking at language lets us avoid hypostatizing language in the way in which the Cartesian epistemological tradition, and particularly the idealist tradition, which built on Kant, hypostatized thought. For it lets us see language not as a tertium quid between subject and object, nor as a medium in which we try to form pictures of reality, but just as part of the behavior of human beings. On this view, the activity of uttering sentences is one of the things people do in order to cope with their environment. So he's explicitly saying, let's use the Davidsonian way of thinking to understand coping. And now here's the qualification. The Deweyan notion of language as tool rather than picture is right as far as it goes. But we must be careful not to phrase this analogy so as to suggest that one can separate the tool, language, from its users and inquire as to its adequacy to achieve our purposes. The latter suggestion presupposes that there's some way of breaking out of language in order to compare it with something else. Well, I would put the point here somewhat differently. He's cautioning against the analogy that Dewey makes, and it's sometimes attributed to Wittgenstein, of thinking of language as a tool. Now I think it's wrong to attribute this analogy to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein doesn't tell us to think of language as a tool. He illuminates some features of linguistic functions by reminding us about how tools work. That's different along just the dimension that I think Dewey trips up on and that Rorty is pointing to here. Dewey says language is a tool, and then softens or complicates that a little by saying it's the tool of tools. He's thinking of it as a kind of meta tool, a tool for producing more tools, new sentences that can be tools for doing things. Rorty's approving of the tool metaphor by contrast to a representational metaphor, but warning us against it. why. It's a fundamental mistake to think, now I'm speaking in propria persona, it's a fundamental mistake to think of language as a tool. Because we understand tools by applying a distinctive kind of intelligibility to them, an instrumental intelligibility. You understand something as a tool by understanding it as a means to an end, a tool for achieving some kind of goal. And it's essential to that instrumental form of intelligibility that you can specify what the goal is independently of and antecedently to saying what the means is of achieving it. So I can say what it is to attach two boards firmly to one another without talking about whether you do that by gluing them or nailing them or screwing them together or clamping them together. I can say and understand what it is for the boards to be firmly attached to one another, independently of thinking of the many different means or instruments, tools that could be used to achieve that end. But it's of the essence of language that what it does is let us produce and understand an indefinite number of novel sentences. This is the observation with which Chomsky kicked off modern linguistics, that almost every sentence uttered by an adult native speaker is radically novel, not just in the sense that that speaker has never heard or produced that sentence before, but in the sense that it's never been produced in the history of the world. Pass the salt or noch eins might get a lot of play, but essentially any sentence that I've uttered today that wasn't a quotation, it's extremely unlikely anyone else has uttered before. And even commoner garden variety sentences say, after you put the baseball equipment in the trunk of the car, make sure you remember the bag of sandwiches. Now, it is vanishingly small probability that anyone has ever uttered just that sequence of words before. And this has been confirmed empirically by sending out indefatigable graduate students to record large corpora, but we can also deduce it from first principles. We don't have grammars that will produce all and only English sentences, but we do have grammars that produce only English sentences. And even if you restrict yourself to the impoverished 5,000 word vocabulary of basic English, you use about 50,000 words in your everyday life and probably understand 100,000. But even if we restrict ourselves to the 5,000 word vocabulary of basic English, there still hasn't been time in the history of the world for us to have uttered any significant proportion of the 20 word long sentences that we can, grammatical sentences we can produce from that, even if all we did was chatter all the time. The capacity of language is to produce an indefinite number of novel sentences in this radical sense of novelty, and so to make an indefinite number of novel claims that no one has ever made before. Consider an indefinite number of novel possibilities or alternatives. Entertain an indefinite number of novel plans. It's a tool, if anything, for coming up with new goals. But that's not a goal that it could be a tool for doing, because there isn't any other way to do that. And there isn't any other way to specify what that is other than talking about language. What language is good for can't be understood according to the model of intelligibility of tools, because there is in principle no other way to do that or to specify what that is apart from invoking features of the tool, of the means to it. This is a point that Dewey never really got on top of. He still thought of language in a reductive way, as though even though he'll tell us, yes, it's wonderful, we can come up with new ends and so on, and yet he still thought as though there were somehow a fixed set of the ends that language could permit us to get. As I say, he explicitly denied that there was a definite totality of ends, but he didn't see that acknowledgement precludes you from thinking of language itself as a tool. Anyway, this is a bit of a long-winded explanation of what I take to be behind this remark of Rorty's. The Deweyan notion of language as a tool, rather than a picture, is right as far as it goes, but it isn't in the end right. We can't think of language in these instrumental terms. Well, he's happy enough to say, well, if we were to talk this way, it would be for coping with each other in the environment. But that's a warning that we're not going to understand that notion of coping and the kind of assessments, well, we can cope better using this vocabulary than this other one, at least in these circumstances and so on. We're not going to understand that apart from, and here's where the Davidsonian picture that he invokes at the beginning of this passage matters. The reason relations that Davidsonian interpretation relies on and reveals, the coping is inseparable from the conversing. It's playing a role articulated by these relations of implication and incompatibility that makes somebody interpretable, conversable with us. Coping and conversation are two ways of talking about the same thing. And downstream from Quine, so is redescription. Because in saying these new things, entertaining these new possible goals, we're altering the meaning of the very words we've used to entertain these. We're giving ourselves new expressive means for saying things. And in that declarativist sense, for describing and redescribing things. Making another step in the argument, I think thinking about things this way, thinking about why the coping talk shouldn't be identified with a reductive evolutionary biological picture of us as having a fixed set of biological needs, which language is, a good way of letting us cooperate so we can get food and not get killed. Yeah, sure, maybe it's good for that, but that's not sort of what it's for. It's for transforming ourselves in the for being a plastic set of practices in the sense that Wittgenstein invokes when he's arguing that it's a motley and you're not going to get a theory of anything more than a time slice of it. It's really deploying practices that have this structure of reason relations that let us justify our claims, contest our claims with others, give reasons, and assess the goodness of reasons. That's the sort of new environment it gives us. And doing that, we can call, well, it is what Rorty is calling coping. Insofar as it suggests a reductive picture, it's not an ideal term. But if we think about it that way, in the Davidsonian terms, then I think we can see another way of characterizing the opposition between a representationalist way of thinking and a pragmatist way of thinking. The pragmatist way of thinking, the Rorty is correctly foisting on Davidson. Davidson himself would never say, I am a pragmatist. He said, I'm a Davidsonian. He was happy to have Rorty throw the mantle of pragmatism over him, but he did not himself use that self-characterization. But for Davidson, the reason he could write articles with titles like Reality Without Reference and see himself as an anti-representationalist is he says what our interpretability depends on is our being able to give and ask for reasons to each other. My being able to attribute to you states that stand in reason relations of implication and incompatibility that support practices of my using claims you make to justify conclusions that I draw, my using my reasons to contest claims that you've made, us conversing. And the nuts and bolts of a Davidsonian interpretation, he says, then involve giving a recursive Tarskian truth theory for the language. So now I'm never sure how much on top of Davidson people are these days, but Davidson's biggest philosophical move was taking Tarski's theory of truth and turning it on its head. So Tarski had said, in effect, if you take meaning for granted in the form of T sentences that have a sentence and its on one side of the biconditional and its translation on the other side, so we're taking meaning for granted, I'll show you recursively how to generate a truth predicate and truth conditions for logically compound sentences. And Davidson says, what Tarski really did was give us a theory of meaning for the logical particles, the ones that corresponded to recursion clauses in the Tarskian theory of truth. And that's a model for a theory of meaning for non-logical expressions. The meaning of a non-logical expression can be represented theoretically by the recursion clause that shows how that expression combines with other expressions to generate an infinite number of complex expressions containing it with the truth conditions derivable from what we've assigned to it. And those truth conditions then determine the meaning relations it stands in. So he says you've got to start with the reason relations. You can attribute extensions and references on that basis, use those to recursively generate truth conditions and meaning and reason relations, not just for the sentences you started from, but for all the sentences in the language. And the criterion of adequacy of your recursive truth theory as a theory of meaning will be whether the meanings, the reason relations that you've derived for these other things, permit interpretability, permit you and me to give and ask each other for reasons and assess each other's reasons. So he's saying the starting point is these reason relations. We go through as a technical matter in semantics, assignments of extensions by saying what the names refer to and what the properties represent, what their extensions are. And then the criteria of adequacy for having gotten that right is the reason relations that we generate again. The representational extensions that we get are purely theoretical postulates to get us from the one set of reason relations we can observe to recursively generate the reason relations for all the sentences that we're not using at any particular time. So the reason he says he's not a representationalist is these representational relations are whatever does the best holistic job of codifying these reason relations. They're pure theoretical auxiliaries for codifying the reason relations. That's a top-down theory that starts with the sentences and the relations of implication and incompatibility they stand in to one another, and understands representation relations in terms of them, with the criterion of adequacy for attributing those being, again, did you get the reason relations right? By contrast, the representationalist order of explanation is bottom up. It starts with representational relations between names and objects and predicates and sets of objects, and builds up truth conditions and inferential and exclusion relations out of those. What's really at stake here, I think, is the order of explanation. Do we start with our practices of justification, of giving one thing as a reason because it implies another, treating these two claims as incompatible so that what's a reason for one is a reason against the other, and mix and match our assignments of what we're talking about holistically in whatever way makes the most sense of those reason relations? That's the Davidsonian pragmatic order of explanation. Or do we work from below, and as in the causal theories of reference that Rorty is arguing about in that introduction to the in the anti-representationalism essay that was the third essay that we look at, the picture, the fantasy for him of causal theories of reference and representation was, we from our philosophical armchairs would understand how you're describing a name when you say what it refers to. What relation are you describing it as standing into what it represents? What relation are you describing a predicate as standing in to the property that's represented by it? We'll be able to determine those objectively. The causal relation between horses and horses, between Gödel and the name Gödel, and then we can build up the reason relations from those. Ultimately, what I think is at stake here is which order of explanation one pursues. That's not the way Rorty puts it, but I think that's the conclusion that the Invocation of Davidson, in just the argumentative places that he invokes him here, comes to. And I can also catch Rorty arguing this way elsewhere in an argument that has not, that never attracted the attention that I think it deserves. This was a freestanding piece about the causal theories of reference. He says, look, let's think about bad theories. Theories of things where most of the claims are false. This could be a theory about witches, in Salem, or it could be a phlogiston theory. He says, we often find ourselves not knowing whether to say, well, these people are talking about real things. They're talking about, crotchety spinsters who live on the edge of town in the one case, but practically everything they believe about them is false. But actually, which does refer to these women. Or phlogiston does refer to oxygen, even though most of the things that the phlogiston theorists were saying were false about oxygen, it never has a negative weight, and so on. Or another way we could go is to say, look, they have so many false beliefs that they've not actually achieved reference to anything. They're just not talking about anything. There are no such things as witches. There is no such thing as phlogiston. Those terms don't refer. And Rorty says, the decision between which way to describe some case, should we say they've managed to refer to something that, according to our best lights, really exists, but practically everything they say about it is false, or should we say their beliefs are so bad that they don't actually make contact with anything that there really is at all? He says that's a sort of low pragmatic decision. Well, which one makes the best sense of them for whatever purposes we're trying to understand them? And there's not going to be a sharp line between it's being correct to say they've achieved reference, but all their beliefs are false, or no, their beliefs are so bad that they didn't manage to hook on to a topic at all. So he says, so any theory that has as a necessary consequence that there is a bright line, an objective line between those, has got to be wrong. But causal theories of reference aspire to tell us what objective property, causal property or modal counterfactual dependence of horses on horses, it is in virtue of which the one represents or refers to the other. It's a consequence then that there's got to be a fact of the matter. That objective causal relation either holds between oxygen and phlogiston or it doesn't. Now, we may have a hard epistemic time figuring it out, but their claim is there is a fact of the matter. And Rorty says, but it isn't that sort of a thing. It's a holistic question of how you can make overall best sense of their behavior, and that isn't going to underwrite this sort of bright line. Now, I take it that in making that argument, he is seeing that what's at issue is the two orders of explanation from a bottom up, starting off with atomistic objective representation relations, building up to the reason relations that let us justify give and assess reasons, or the top-down picture that starts with our practices of justifying, giving evidence for and against, contesting our claims, and so on, and understands our semantics and epistemology in terms of those practices. So this is, my attempt to reconstruct a line of thought latent, sort of beneath the text, that would justify the claims that we're seeing him making here. As I say, these arguments and issues are going to be with us for the rest of the course. But first, with the talk about truth, the Jamesian slogan as what is best in the way of belief, as opposed to accuracy of representation or correspondence with the facts. So, well, if you combine declarativism with expressivism about truth, build on top of that, appreciate the what's distinctive about the distinction of social perspective between attributing a commitment and undertaking one by saying something is true, and then build a deflationary theory of embedded uses of true on that, then you can understand what's right about the Jamesian account. And on the heading of representationalism, if we think of it as an issue of order of explanation between these practices of justifying, which are at this level common to different disciplines. I mean, give and ask, give and assess reasons, contest each other's claims in the law, in literary criticism, in the scientific laboratories, and in the ethics classroom as well. And Rorty's saying, focus on that. That's what makes these claims mean what they mean, is the relation they stand in of implication, of justification, of evidence, and so on, for and against each other. Focus on that. That's what makes them truth evaluable in this Jamesian sense. And don't think that that's all the reflection of an objective representational structure. It's the other way around. Insofar as we talk representation talk, it's answering to these top-level reason relations. Okay. Well, I can see that I'm not going to get to talk about the development, the arc of thought. You might find it useful to look at that piece. It's a short and straightforward piece if you haven't looked at it, that's sort of saying how he might have gotten here to think about this. For next week, though we're going to come back to Rorty, I wanted to put on the table Cheryl Misak's critique of Rorty, because she, as I say, is certainly for my money, but I think generally agreed to be the premier philosophical scholar of pragmatism of her generation. And she thinks Rorty has kidnapped pragmatism and put it to death in the use that he's making of it, and has very trenchant criticisms of his appropriation of, his, dare I say it, redescription of the pragmatist tradition. And because her hero in the current generation of pragmatists is Hugh Price, who says he agrees with Rorty about everything, we're going to want to be adjudicating this issue that's sort of internal to Misak's critique, partly has to do with the sort of situation of the Rorty constellation of views in the pragmatist tradition, but also as we see it morphing into this expressivist way of thinking. So what we're reading is, for next week, is Misak's presidential address called Rorty, Pragmatism and Analytic Philosophy, which really sets this out. Oh, sorry, her Rorty, Pragmatism and Analytic Philosophy, then her presidential address, American Pragmatism and Indispensability Arguments, which is non-trivially concerned not to let Rorty have pragmatism. And then Bjorn Romberg on the wonderful things Misak has done in redescribing pragmatism, but also wanting to place her in space with respect to Rorty in a less oppositional way than she feels, anyway, than she has pitched things. What I have in the interminable list of supplementary things is a bunch of reviews of, most of which are quite short, of various of the now 5 or 6 books that Misak has articulated her view in, because we're not reading those books. I mean, they're worth reading, but so much being so little time, we can't do that. But looking at those, I think, is helpful. Third from the end is another Misak essay, Pragmatism and Pluralism. See how much reading the earlier ones has done. And then another review and another Rorty piece that is in a certain way responsive. He doesn't mention Misak, but is in a certain way responsive to that. I'll be talking about the other Misak and the other Rorty. It really is the first three essays, not the supplementary ones that matter, but I just wanted to tell you what was going on. Because as we come back to Rorty the following week, I want us to have the issues that Misak has raised available so that we can be sort of seeing what justice we think there is to them. And because all of that is assembling raw materials we'll need for the second phase, for the Price and Blackburn version. I should say generally, Blackburn was the second wave metaethical expressivist, absolutely opposed to Rorty, throughout their careers, clashing with him. Indeed, Blackburn and I have had some somewhat memorable clashes in print, in one of which he accused me of not knowing what putting your hand on a hot stove would be like. But Price brought Blackburn around. And Blackburn and I have long since reconciled. Even though I am the Rorty student, Blackburn teeters on calling himself a pragmatist, but was moved way off of his earlier opposition to this by Hugh Price. So one of the things I expect will be enlightening is to watch Blackburn being seduced by what Price makes of these Rorty arguments and the way he deploys them in the expressivist vocabulary for redescribing these issues. So anyway, Misak next time, and even though we can't begin to do justice to this fabulous body of work that she has produced and is producing, it'll be an introduction to one of the contemporary philosophers who should be a character in your world, where she has engaged with this issue that we're addressing. So that's what's coming for next time. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording, but I'll hang around for the next few minutes if there are things people want to talk about. Otherwise, see you next week.